Good morning to you all. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce our next speaker, Samiya Selim. Dr. Samiya Selim is an associate professor and the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh. She specialized in the interdisciplinary areas of social ecological systems, sustainability science, climate change adaptation and resilience, and science policy interface. Currently, her work is focused on ecosystem-based adaptation, alternate livelihoods, and sustainable aquaculture in coastal areas of Bangladesh, which are facing increased salinity and erosion. She's also working on urban spaces and the private sector on sustainable consumption and production, plastic waste reduction, and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in Bangladesh. Samiya Selim has worked in UK and Bangladesh the past 10 years in the field of environmental conservation, climate change, and fisheries. Her previous work includes mobilizing hard to reach communities in getting involved in the environmental activities. She has also worked on using historical approaches to capture shifting baselines in fisheries and coastal ecosystems. Recently, Samiya has published the first book on achieving sustainable development goals related to the environment in Bangladesh. Meantime, she's a member of IMBeR Human Dimensions Working Group, which focuses on the interactions between human and ocean ecosystems, and whose goal is to promote an understanding of the multiple feedbacks between human and ocean systems. Her talk this morning is about addressing equity as a solution that can link both conservation and sustainable development in the management of social ecosystems. Please give a warm welcome to Samiya Selim.
Thank you, Rhoda. Good morning, everybody. I am really immensely pleased to be here today, and thank you so much for inviting me to give a talk here at Future Oceans Conference. My journey with IMBeR itself goes back a few years. I first attended the IMBeR summer school in Turkey in my first year of my PhD back in 2012, and then again at the end of my PhD, just before going for my viva at IMBeR in Trieste. So it's really lovely to see so many familiar faces of what I'd like to really think of as the IMBeR family. My journey, after my PhD, I moved back to Bangladesh after being abroad for almost 11 years, and then I started working as the director of Center for Sustainable Development at University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh. For all you master's and PhD students out there, just advise you stick with IMBeR. They really support early career scientists, and I appreciate the support they have given me, and I'm really pleased to be here today to give my talk today on addressing equity and how do you ensure long-term sustainability and solutions that combine both coastal conservation as well as blue economy development. I consider myself a social ecological scientist. My background is in natural sciences, but I've been working primarily in this intersection, and really for me the journey goes back to 100 years ago when I started studying the North Sea during my PhD, and I looked at shifting baselines and studying historical fishing, coastal tourism, as well as other changes in coastal ecosystem services along the Yorkshire coast. I looked at how things change in the ecosystem, how does that impact the socioeconomic changes, And really, my interest is in this interdisciplinary research from, studying cod, herring, and other species in the North Sea, and 100 years of data on that. I have now moved to studying in fisheries in a completely different system in the Bay of Bengal, Indian Oceans in Bangladesh. And this conference on ocean sustainability for the benefit of society, as scientists, we try to understand some of the challenges and the science behind it, but I think to come up with the solutions of how we can achieve this sustainability for the benefit of society, there is really a need to have even a bigger headspace, or really a balancing act where you get to wear multiple hats, and it's not just natural and social sciences. We've heard earlier Ingrid's talk on the need for, and I already had psychology in there from before, behavioral sciences, marketing, working with the private sector, anthropology, storytelling, which was such a big part of my PhD, and now even more so as I work with fishermen in Bangladesh. There is need for innovation where you need also entrepreneurs and startups, and again, at this conference, heard some fantastic talks on how we're using technology and startup companies to help us in achieving, in reducing bycatch, or in trying to have sustainable management of the oceans. And I'm going to add to this list now accountant, because again, at this conference, heard a fantastic talk on how, by Jan, on how, get into the minds of these CEOs and big corporates and how they work. And I really think there's, as we try and communicate our science to the public, we need to be also engaging with, obviously with government and NGOs, but also with the private sector and with the end consumer. If we can get them to buy in to our science and change their behavior to lead more sustainable lifestyles, I think we're already halfway there to achieving this ocean sustainability. So we've already had, so just again, today's talk, I'm going to very briefly touch on this kind of global picture of the blue economy, because we've already heard fantastic, so by Eddie and then again by Ingrid, but I'd just like to show a picture of what blue economy would mean for a developing nation. My talk is also, it's external, kind of touching on all the grand challenges, but specifically I'm interested on Grand Challenge 3 on improving and achieving sustainable ocean governance, and the Innovation Challenge 4, which is how do we use some of this social science data, and how does that feed back into our models and our other areas for ocean management and decision-making and policy. So in a developing nation, so this is from the World Bank report, and I found it interesting when I was looking for infographics to capture, what blue economy is. And, when you look at papers or working reports by people from in Europe or North America, you have a lot more on some of the extractive biotechnology, a lot of the other aspects of the blue economy. But for a developing nation, we're still, trying to get it right with, there's still a lot of focus on fisheries, tourism. Climate change is a big factor in their waste management and renewables. And these are really the areas that I'll be focusing on in my talk today, and showing how in Bangladesh, from my experience of working there the last 3 years in these sectors, what are some of those key issues that we also have to address, equity. And when I say long-term sustainability, in this whole project-run, donor-driven run projects that tend to happen in Bangladesh and other developing nations, how do you then move there to transformation to sustainability and self-sustaining, and still being able to continue this traction towards achieving sustainability after projects have ended? very briefly, I'm not going to go into those figures there. We have seen that, I mean, and really the takeaway from this slide is the fact that when this is shown in the Ministry of Fisheries or in Bangladesh, when we were looking at how the value of the ocean economy, and given that it's going to be the 7th largest economy in the world and is set to double that, employment, food, and other economic growth, what the danger, or I would say the danger, the critique of this, as Eddie had mentioned, is that, people see this as a way to have another piece of the action and, get in on that extraction of our oceans. And this is from the Commonwealth Blue Charter, which is really the people that I'm working with on blue economy, to the danger that let's not jump on this bandwagon and get in on the all the different ways that we can make money from blue economy development, industrial fishing, as well as ports, shipping, mining. In Bangladesh, the cell that has been given the responsibility, government cell of growing the blue economy, has been the mining energy wing of the government, which kind of, shows the intention of where they're seeing what it means for the blue economy. But there's the other part to it, and the fact that, before all these future development on how we can grow the blue economy, the fact that fishing and seafaring and stewardship of the ocean, this has been part of the traditional way of life of communities living in many countries. That has already been part of their social fabric. Their lives and livelihoods are already embedded with working in this space. So we need to be aware of that and realize that, increasing certain sectors in the blue economy has to also not be at the expense of others, such as artisanal fishing and as well as small-scale fisheries. So that was my global, giving the outline of where I think we need to be going from a developing nation perspective of how we view the blue economy. And now I'm just going to go straight into my work that I've been doing in Bangladesh around livelihoods specifically, but in fisheries and aquaculture. But it's always linked with climate change adaptation, because it's we're still in, we're feeling it everywhere, but you come to Bangladesh and you really see the impacts of climate change there. There's also the windows of opportunities for, there's resources there that can be used to help people adapt to some of these impacts, and at the same time reduce poverty, increase livelihoods. And tourism, again, is another potential avenue that Bangladesh is focused on. And lastly, which is really the main chunk of my work, is around how do you use new technology and innovation that are pro-poor, that, it's kind of looking beyond technology. That's great that we now have these solutions, but how do we ensure that everyone, or, people who need it, are able to benefit from it? So I'll touch a little bit on the renewable energy and the integrated marine trophic aquaculture projects that I'm involved in. So the first study I wanted to before that, to Bangladesh. This is really how, it's kind of how I feel about Bangladesh, this extreme contrasting love, and I don't like to use the word hate, despair, that I feel about Bangladesh. It is a tiny country. It has 165 million people. People here have been to Bangladesh or have worked in Bangladesh? All right, a few show of hands. That's great. But it is one of the fastest growing economy in Asia. That's mostly to do with our RMG, ready-made garments sector. I have 6% here, but I saw this year it's now 8%. it is now transitioning from a least developing country to a lower middle income country. I don't know who comes up with these terms. I don't know what lower middle income means, but from directly what it means in the sector I work with is that we will stop receiving a lot of the aid grants that least developing countries are eligible for, and we have to become more self-sustaining financially, and I think it'll move from grants to loans from banks. That's not really my expertise. I just know that's going to be our status, and a lot of work is going towards that. The cities are crowded, a lot of problems with waste, unplanned rapid development in cities, but at the same time, really rich in natural resources. It's a country of 1,000 rivers. Our marine waters are hotspots for biodiversity. We have some of these large marine mammals, several that are endangered, but also still the largest population of Irrawaddy dolphin, Gangetic River dolphins, and we're just discovering more as we're venturing out into the marine waters. There's just been a lot of exciting work going towards what our system has. We've a very productive nation. It's the third largest inshore aquaculture after China and India, and the fifth largest aquaculture, I think China, India, Vietnam, Indonesia. Our marine waters support habitat for many species, and Sundarbans, which is the largest mangrove forest in the world, again, hotspot for biodiversity and important nursing grounds for many important commercial as well as other species. So that's really the space that I work in. At the same time, Bangladesh is also considered as one of the most vulnerable, I think the sixth most vulnerable country to feel the impacts of climate change. This is due to the fact of it's a flat, low-lying topography. You can see the funnel-shaped coastline and this really high population density. It's just to put it in perspective, we're barely the size of Ohio in the States, and our population is 165 million people. It's a lot of people. There's also high levels of poverty there and reliance on livelihoods that are really sensitive to climate change, and so agriculture, fisheries, and using water resources dependent on that. So the area, some of the biggest challenges we face is this massive salinity intrusion, erosion, and frequent extreme weather events. I mean, we've always had cyclones and floods, that's a known thing, but over the years we've been seeing it happening at erratic times when it's not expected, as well as the frequency has increased. My work, it's mostly in that coastal belt. I highlighted in red the areas, the villages and communities that I work with. Part of it inland around the mangrove forests, people living on the fringe of the mangrove forests, inshore, inland, and then as well as some of the islands just at the bottom of the country. Mentioned this area that I work in. So this is a marine protected area. It's a UNESCO heritage site. There's all kinds of, legal protection for the forest, but, the people also living there are really poor. And what happens with, all this development that we're having overall in Bangladesh, the coast, the south, kind of gets left behind, except for a few key industries that are important for economic growth, shrimp farming, transport, shipping. So you're trying to work in this space where, there's need for conservation and protection, but then you're also dealing with really, so landless women, women-headed households that turn to illegal fishing, not out of choice, not to make money, but just to survive. And this last one, other factor that I have to deal in the work I do is there's a lot of migration where this last picture, where we're doing that FGD, it got washed away, the back part of it. So that was their home, and then half of it is now gone. So there's a lot of migration where the men have moved out, and now you're left with females there. The land you cannot cultivate anymore. It's very saline. How do you, and then they end up turning, to the forest for their resources. There's a lot of pressure on the coastal natural systems. So how do you work in this space or work, with these challenges while at the same time trying to, have growth and develop and the bigger picture of this blue economy, which Bangladesh has embraced, big time, and our government's very keen. There's a lot of funding that's come in to develop these sectors, and I just, wanted to point out what are some of the things we need to consider as we're developing this. The work that I did here is with, so they're not tour guides, they're trawlermen, so not fishermen. They have boats and they ferry people across the rivers, and this is not a part of the Sundarbans where tourism is already big. So it's the I don't have the map here, but it's the more closer to India, the western side. And these men here have been trained to become eco-tour operators. So as you said, they've been given equipment. When I say equipment, they've been given chairs and a thing on top, shading, to shield you from the sun. Some basic safety, first aid kit, and training really on, how do you attract people to come to your boats, do a little ride through the mangroves, identifying flora, fauna, don't litter, getting people to not, trash the environment, and as well as once this, bit of help is taken away, how do you build up on this, some business skills and saving skills. And the things that I encountered, so I was hired by ILO, the International Labour Organization, as part of their Green Jobs Initiative, so to look at ecotourism, trawlermen come ecotour operators, plus on organic farming, and women cultivating mushrooms, but the one that I'm presenting here is this work. And one of the things that keeps on coming time and time again, and Eddie had mentioned this as well, when we're selecting, when we're running experiments or choosing communities to work with, how do you, during the selection process, what's the process behind it? And there's a lot of bias and discord, and what had happened with these men were the process wasn't transparent, and rather being able to form a committee cooperative and bring in others, they were actually, then everybody was upset with them. They were antagonized, and then they couldn't really take it forward. It kind of separated them from the other trawler men. And it's not saying that everybody needs to be part of any new solution or initiative, but the process has to be transparent of why you're selected, and it wasn't the case with this man. I think it was like the forest guard knew someone, worked with him, his friends, and so on, and that's how it happened. The other problem they faced with, when you're trying to diversify livelihoods and also use that as a way to have conservation and protection of the ecosystem, there has to be capacity building. And they were given training, yes, individual training on how to be better tour operators, but there is the roads are bad, or there's nowhere to stay there. There's no restaurants or shops, so you can't build that one aspect of ecotourism by just training the people to be eco-tour operators when you don't have, the natural beauty is there, like why people would go there is there, but you also need to develop other areas to make it so that it can be sustainable. As a result, over the 2 years, 3 years they did this, the money they were making, yes, it went up. Winter months it went up because that's the tourist season, but due to all these other infrastructural issues, it really wasn't helping to, build their resilience, or so that they can now say, okay, I can, if they're not able to really make that much more, and they have kind of been isolated from others in their community. And the more complex thing that I learned from this project was the fact that the tourism and the forestry people don't talk. So mangrove forest is the biggest tourist attraction, a natural tourist attraction in Bangladesh, but it's driven very much on a private profit-making, take lots of tourists out there, see and leave, rather than focus on the conservation as well. And then you have the Department of Forestry who are, working towards the conservation, but they don't see any benefit to these local people becoming more aware and becoming they're not interested in more people coming to Sundarbans to protect the forest, because the revenue that comes in for that doesn't go to them at all. So there's just this lack of conversation between tourism and the forestry department. The things that I did think was, that some of it was good, the fact that you're able to diversify your incomes, and this knowledge generation, what these men have learned. And hopefully, if, in the future, if a program is made where you're trying to develop tourism, but you have to take all these other factors into consideration. This market linkages is a really important one as well. The fact that there is now a niche market for, this kind of tourism, they can build on it, but they're not aware of really anything to do that's happening with tourism. So, and the fact that tourism has to be linked in with some of the other SDGs. So right now there's SDG 12.7 or 6 that talks about building sustainable tourism. But, in the case of Bangladesh, you also need to link it up with SDG 15 on conservation of forests, or SDG 14. And those links have to be made up as you're trying to build up the tourism sector in a country like Bangladesh. This book that I did on the environmental sustainable goals in Bangladesh, within that I did a chapter on cultural ecosystem services and the importance of local environmental knowledge. And really what I looked at, we interviewed tourists and we interviewed the local users, and we asked the local users, what do they feel is the value of, so not the provisional services they get, but what do they do for recreation in the Sundarbans, or what are the things that they value about the water around them. And their views were very much linked with the cultural values. So there's a lot of things around Bon Bibi, which means the forest goddess. When they value the forest, but it's linked very much to their religion and to their culture. And there's things in their anecdotes and stories and myths that's associated with the forest and the water bodies around the forest. And I think some of those, if brought out as we're developing tourism in the Sundarbans, would really add value as we're trying to build up. So rather than in the second picture, lots of tourists coming, all they want to come and see is a tiger. I've been there 8 times, I still haven't seen a tiger. And they're not really getting to understand that there's a lot of other ways they can appreciate being in this space. And I feel if more of the local stories and myths and the cultural values that they place in these mangrove systems is taken into consideration, you can really build up tourism in a sustainable way, which will also help in conservation and management of this region. The picture on that. So what we've started seeing is lots of rhesus monkeys now coming forward because the tourists are feeding them, and and other species also coming forward. Whereas this last one here, when we were interviewing the people, it was just there, and they're really part of the system, or part of this, and to get them involved in building up local tourism homestays, and other ways that you can build up tourism would really help in conservation, revenue generation, bringing in the finances and growth that can help protect the mangroves of Bangladesh. A lot of my work has been on climate change adaptation. When I moved to Bangladesh, I did not want to reinvent the wheel. I know a lot of work has already been going on. I hadn't lived there in 17 years, 11 years in UK and the US before that, and I had great ideas, things I want to do there around ecosystem-based management, but adaptation where you can combine conservation and development and adaptation at the same time. So what I did was I worked with an existing project that had been running for 11 years, a USAID project on protection of natural resource management, on building adaptation, and then I went and I looked at case studies on their work. They worked all over Bangladesh, but they literally have sites all over, but I focused on the areas that they worked here, and also I did an line also here and here. And I looked at the initiatives they have taken around polyculture, where they're mixing you have vegetables and fish. Craft fattening is another new, those aren't new anymore, adaptation strategy that people are uptaking in these really saline waters now, and more, due to sea level rise and inundation, there's more water that's coming, saline water that's coming inland. So, you're looking at what kind of adaptation can the communities living around in this area, in these coastal regions do. So there's been a lot of work on women's economic empowerment, linking them with the private sector, giving them the training to run homestead, pond aquaculture, poultry rearing, and really building on CBOs, community-based organizations, having cooperatives. And so I went and evaluated, and I did a report on how some of the work they're doing, how would more nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approach, is it already existing in the work they're doing? And if so, how can it be scaled up? How can it be done in other areas? And what I found through this work is this issue of social justice and power struggles and all these other factors that I did not even really consider when I first went into this space. So some of the findings, I'll just go to the third point first, the fact that when we're developing new work, what I found is this lack of integration of knowledge. There's a lot of wealth of knowledge that already exists, but it's not documented. It only exists in donor project reports, or you have academic papers on it, which are not necessarily, they're kind of parallel. You have, the academics working on the same issue, running their own studies, going to these villages, writing it up, and that's what we get to see. And then you have the NGOs also working in the same space, but not talking to one another, both working on adaptation, but not knowledge, sharing that knowledge in some kind of hub space, talking to each other. I mean, you have the meetings where they talk to each other, but me going there at first, it just wasn't there. But I've also found that a lot of the work they're doing, conservation can really be integrated into this work. And there is a lot of links to development work where you can build in natural resource management and conservation in these areas. So that's some of the findings. But what I saw also was that building that local leadership, the projects that were successful as opposed to the ones who were not, it really boiled down to who, because the project's now ended, and the ones that are still running or see themselves, have hope that it'll continue, is the ones that have really built good local leadership. And this was mentioned yesterday, leaders who have that multiplier effect that they then capacitate other leaders to continue the work. And that's been a very successful, one of the key things that I think we need to harvest when we build on these. But some of the challenges, there were some systematic barriers which limits the progress of enabling an environment for building on sustainability and development of growth that is sustainable. Some of these are, we have, been hearing about, and I already knew the fact that, now they grow their own vegetables, or they're able to plant mangroves, and they're have ponds, have their own, little homestead ponds, but they don't have access to the market, so they have to sell at cheap prices. They have all these middlemen. There's like a complex system of how, what they're doing, and the value of that, what they're making, and what it is valued at when it comes to the cities and global is very different. Even if you give them new solutions and innovative ways where you can have protection of natural resources as well as ways to make livelihood, they necessarily don't have the finance beyond they can't take loans or bank loans, or they just don't have to be able to invest in these. But underlying all of this was weak governance. It was corruption. It was, land grabbing, and, people who could do it are the ones who have land illegally or otherwise, people who are just, dependent on illegal fishing or going to the forest. They really don't have the power, and the power is very much tied to having land. Local governance. And this is not governance as in they're not at all connected to the wider, the governance at the top. This is just the chairman and the people that they're having to deal with. So from this, bringing it back to blue economy development in a developing nations, as we're trying to have economic growth, we have to also think about who is it for, and who does it benefit, and how do you get others, who don't have a voice into that center as well. And these some of the key things on market access and diversifying livelihood. The community has to accept, what kind of new ventures or new innovation that you're bringing out, and you have to have long-term sustainability of what happens when project ends. So part of that solution, so all this was more like, okay, it's kind of challenging, not going anywhere. So I've been working with Marion Glaser from ZMT, and we've been looking at what kind of aquaculture would be good as part of a that'll help with ecosystem-based adaptation, help some of these people with, their livelihoods, and integrated multitrophic aquaculture is what we've been looking at. In a nutshell, as you can see, it's really having species at different trophic level. You have the fed aquaculture, fish, shrimp, and then you have mollusks, shellfish, and then you have the seaweed. And prior to obviously going to the field, we've been looking at this academic literature and with experts at ZMT. A lot of papers have been written on how this can be applied to countries like Bangladesh. And at the moment, this is done in Canada. It's been successful in Canada and several other countries, but it can be done in both salt and brackish water, which would be suitable for the areas that I'm working for Bangladesh. The economic benefits of it, there's lower production costs because you're not having to feed the other two layers. And then there's also, it'll produce high-value seafood that can generate income, help with economic growth. At the same time, the environmental benefits are there. It'll absorb pollutants, and it'll tolerate a wide range of salinity which is needed. And then you can see some of the other ones as well. So we've been looking at it inshore, but it can also be done in open waters as well. We have been focusing a lot on, okay, that's great. As a technology, it seems, it's working. It can be something that can be adapted as a solution to in Bangladesh, but how do we ensure that this does not exclude the poor. If it's too expensive, if it's, how do we make sure that it's done in a way that it'll provide all those factors, food security and higher food production, crop diversification, and at low cost for the poor. And so we started looking at conditions for having aquaculture that would be pro-poor. And we did a survey, and what we found out, people are still very negative to aquaculture because especially the poorer people who don't have land, the females, the lower income people, they see aquaculture as something for the rich, for the people with power, for the land. So there's already this negative, that's not for me, I can't do that. And they gave all these reasons. So we got their perspective, and then we started trying to have a more holistic understanding of not just from the aspect of the poor, but also the scientific community, how they feel about it, the government, NGOs, private businesses, and from all our experiences, we learned that within the community, there's the landowners, the landless, as well as female-headed households, and we really started identifying all the different actors and see that who are these actors in the coastal fisheries aquaculture, and how are they interlinked, and what are the important changes and interventions needed. So we did, again, a study where we did net maps with all these different stakeholders, and I'm just going to give a brief two understanding. So from this, one of the net maps, this is from the view when we did net maps with the national government, and those different colors on top are just the different actors. The links are whether it was cooperative, conflict, command control, and whether it was flow of money. And what was interesting to see from the government's perspective is the fact that, so the government felt, they're very much the command control. They give the licenses both to the private sector and to the local farmers. You have the academics who provide some information on, aquaculture technology to the government, but then you have the local community who also provide information to academics and researchers. At the same time, you have the NGOs who give both information to the poor farmers on better technology in aquaculture, as well as materials to the farmers. The private sector had no link with the community, and there was no link with the NGOs and private sector, and there was no research communicated from the academics to the local community. That was the government's perspective. Then you have the landless women that we interviewed, and they view the government very negatively. It's conflict and obstruction, what they were supposed to receive, they haven't. These are people that have been affected by the cyclone Isla, and lost. And there's also tiger widows, which is really women whose husbands have died attacked by tigers and been killed in the forest. And what you see from the NGOs, all they received are things, not knowledge. They received assets, and you can see here they gave filters and saris and money, but not training or knowledge. So again, this is just the preliminary finding of a study. We're still working on this. But the idea is that when you ask different people in that system, they have very different views on how these linkages are formed and who would really benefit if you were to introduce a new technology that is sustainable, that would help have more sustainable aquaculture, ecosystem-based adaptation, and increased livelihoods. And it is with this understanding that we're now going to the next step and working with a certain group of landless people and developing IMTA with their input on what's local species and would work there. And this is really a range of the different, they're all working in aquaculture. You have the landless men, you have all these women who have been given training. You had people who are doing crab fattening, but they don't have the knowledge and they keep dying. They have lots of high mortality. And at the same time, they need feed, which the villagers are giving their own food to the crab to, so they can grow. And so it's definitely not been sustainable. And then you have another shrimp farmer who became really, really, really rich. He has his own seaplane, but started at the same level as them. And he just had lots of land. So there's lots of different things we have to consider, and using the systems approach is a way to understanding before we introduce any new technology into these systems. My last one, the work I'm doing, I'm really excited about this. As I mentioned, Bangladesh, there's been a lot of work recently on marine mammals and the high population of these species we have down south of the Bay of Bengal. But at the same time, as you know, the threats they face is entanglement in fishing gear. So we've been working on that, and the key challenging is balancing the needs of these, fishermen with biodiversity protection. So we gave these fishermen, when I say we, I've been working with WCS, Wildlife Conservation Society, and they gave these fishermen GPS and early warning signals so they know to, come back when a storm is coming, and in turn, the fishermen have been collecting all this data on these bycatch and species, and from there, we've identified hotspots where some of these marine mammals are, and we've been working with the fishermen on, having them release some of the larger populations. But more than the fact that they're now aware and try not to have bycatch or do illegal fishing is the fact we're also getting all this citizen science data from these fishermen who, it's not high sophisticated scientists going out. We don't have the capacity to do that yet. So it's been a very promising work. As I mentioned, what we found out was that the shark industry, again, had no idea about that, and all the knowledge was from these fishermen. So it's been quite promising. And what we're doing with them now is working with WCS and looking at the women, so not the fishermen going out there who are still collecting the data, but the women in a dry fish trade. And whilst it is very lucrative in some areas of Bangladesh, the island that I'm working at, Nijumdeep, where this work is taking place, the women there still don't have good access to the market. So we're going to be doing a study of that as well. And at the same time, working with Kiel University on renewable energy, on how you can have solar powered cold storage on the boats, so these fishermen can, have less, they can store the fish for longer, get better price when it's come back, and that battery, that solar powered, I call it the magic box. When it comes back, it can also bring home and light up their homes so that women can at night be able to cook and children can study. And in these islands, there's no electricity, there's no grid electricity, so it's quite promising. And I'd just really like to end there with some of the key points on this partnership building, where it seems a lot of the work I'm doing is with the NGOs and development practitioners, and coming from a academic background, it's been there's different languages and different goals and different timescales and very project-driven, or, me wanting to understand systems, whereas they have things, they need to meet targets. But it's important to have these partnerships, and it's important to give feedback to the communities so that they also really, they are part of that system when we're trying to develop ocean management and better conservation of our oceans. And this vertical development, is what I mean is let's not finish one and then that's over. Let's build on what's already been happening. As we continue to ask more questions and develop our research, let's build on existing work that's been done, so you can create this knowledge hub. Then you can get from that and grow from there to finding solutions to ocean sustainability. My last slide here, really some of the key points that I have come to appreciate from the work that I'm doing in Bangladesh. It's really important to have this knowledge hub, knowledge sharing networks where both decision makers and academics and NGOs and communities can be informed of what's going on. Building local capacity, very key. but helping them to form these cooperatives so they can continue the work is very key. And looking at it past just the projects, finding financial schemes, market access, profit making, for these communities so that they can be part of this ocean sustainability. And the success of this blue economy, like any economy, is linked to other priorities like poverty reduction, climate change adaptation, strong governance, and employment generation. Before I end there, I just wanted to say so I rushed through the 3 studies, but there is 3 talks tomorrow by Sarah Minaro, Ike, and Annette, and they'll actually be going a lot more. You can actually search for Bangladesh in the app, and it brings up their 3 talks, so it was quite useful to see what time they're on looking at how participatory research, getting the community involvement when you're developing project, on modeling, how do you bring in well-being of fishermen into our bigger models, as well as on, what innovations are working, what's not, why are people not taking up, and they'll be going more into that. So I would highly recommend attending those talks. And thank you very much for your interest.
Thank you, Samiya, for your interesting talk and your passionate project in Bangladesh. We don't have time anymore for questions because of the break time coffee, but you can talk to Samiya and discuss with her during break times. Thank you all. And I have a little gift for you.